me change the view. Okay, so I want to start really with some words of introduction. As you know, Esther is a book of the Bible, comes from the third part of the Bible. You know, the Hebrew Bible is broken into three parts. The first is the Torah itself. The second is a historical section called the First Prophets, and then the writings or speeches, more properly, of the prophets of Israel. That's the second part, former and latter prophets. And then the third part is simply called writings. It's a miscellaneous listing of different books. And among the writings, we have a series of books, short books, which are grouped together as megillot, as scrolls. We often talk about Esther as being the megillah, but megillah just means scrolls. And there are other megillot as well. It comes from the Hebrew word golel, which means to roll. So all the books, in some sense, are megillot, but these are short. What's really well, a couple of things. It takes place in Persia, in modern Iran, and it takes place, at least most scholars think it's written maybe in the 5th century before the Common Era. So a long time ago. And it describes the life, it takes place in the exile, the life of the Persian Jewish community. And it is the only book completely set in the diaspora. And I'll have more to say about that when we, and what that community, what the Jewish community in Persia may have been like once we get into the book itself. But it's set in the diaspora. It is, the Jews have returned, right? The Babylonians destroy the temple and exile the Jewish community in 586. The Babylonians are conquered by the Persians, and the Persian king, Cyrus, allows the Jewish community to return to the land of Israel, and they rebuild the temple and so on. But it's clear that lots of Jews stay in the diaspora. They don't go back. And so this is a story about that community and may well have been written in Persia. It has a lot of words, loan words in it that exist in Persian and not in Hebrew. The king, who's called Ahasuerus, has been identified with the Persian king Xerxes. But as we'll see, there is no Persian king named Ahasuerus. And it's unlikely that this story is really talking about a king at all. Most scholars think that this is a made-up story, right? Not a historical story. And maybe it's based around some historical kernel, but even that seems far-fetched. And it is intended in part as a kind of farce. It's perhaps the most humorous book in the Bible. Themes are those of reversal. So things are not what they seem to be. People are not who they seem to be. Everybody's wearing a mask. And what could be more appropriate for Purim? We have descriptions of costumes. We have lots and lots of banquets, lots of drinking. Drinking seems to form a major role in the story. And it's not coincidental that drinking forms a major role in the holiday of Purim, as does feasting. The rabbis tell us that we should become so inebriated that we can't tell the difference between Haman and Purim, the Haman and Mordechai. Actually, I don't think that's so great. And certainly if you have a problem with alcohol, you shouldn't do it. But the idea really is here one of raucous celebration. One of the things that's most striking about this book is its secular quality. I can't think of another book of the Torah, of the Bible rather, which makes no mention of God whatsoever. Jews are kind of Jewish. They're identified, self-identified Jews, but there doesn't seem to be any religion. There's no talk about God. We don't see the Jews practicing Jewish religion. This is an assimilated diaspora community. I would say much like the one we live in. And it's worth bearing that in mind, and I'll have a little bit more to say about that shortly. Just give me 1 second. I want to check one thing. No, okay. So let me put this back down again. Okay, so I want to get into the book itself, and we're going to start with Esther, and we're at chapter 1, verse 1. Again, for those who came later, I'm going to be reading from the translation of Robert Alter, part of his massive translation of the Hebrew Bible. So it happened in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus, who was king from India to Kush. Kush is in Africa. 127 provinces, right? So he has a vast kingdom. In those days, when Ahasuerus was seated on his royal throne, which was in Shushan, the capital, in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a great banquet in his presence for all his ministers, his servants, the freeholders of Persia and Media, the noblemen, ministers of the prophets. When he showed the wealth of his kingdom's glory and the worth of the splendor of his greatness many days, 180 days. So we start out with a party that lasts for half a year, right? Which already we're beginning to see that this is not exactly historical. By the way, so they're all partying and they're all drinking for half a year. And these are all the officials in this vast kingdom, right? Nobody seems to be taking care of business. It doesn't seem to be a concern at all. Okay, so then when the half a year was gone, the king made a banquet for all the people who were in Shushan, the capital, from the greatest to the least, a 7-day banquet in the garden court of the king's pavilion, right? So even the commoners get to celebrate, but they only get a week. And probably they couldn't fit in the palace, so they're all out in the gardens, right? And we have a description of the king's pavilion: white linen, indigo cotton, fastened with cords of fine crimson cloth on silver cylinders and marble columns, great and gold and silver couches on a paving of alabaster and marble and mother of pearl and black pearl. And so beautiful, magnificent palace. And drink was proffered in golden vessels, and the vessels of various kinds, in abundant royal wine in kingly fashion. And the drinking was according to the royal rule. There was no compulsion. In other words, open bar. Drink as much as you want. No one will stop you. And this, again, everybody in the entire kingdom of Persia, 127 provinces are all drinking. Okay, so Vashti, we don't know anything about her except that she is the queen. Vashti too made a banquet in the royal house that was Ahasuerus's on the 7th day, when the king was of good cheer through wine. Right, so here we go. He's really drunk. Right, he's been drinking for a year. Now he's been drinking for a week. He said to, and now we get a list of his eunuchs who serve the presence of King Ahasuerus. Now, whether they're really eunuchs or not, one of the issues here seems to be sexuality. I'll have more to say about that in a minute. So maybe they are, but Mehuman Bitzaltha Hashbona Big Etha Agavtha Zethan and Carcass, right? I don't have the Hebrew in front of me, so I'm simply trying to read the way Alter has put it, and of course that's not so easy. The 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, and they were told to bring King Vashti before the king rather, in royal crown, to show her beauties to the peoples and the ministers, for she was comely to look at. So picture this, an absolutely drunken party, all men, right? And now the king, who's really drunk, says, get me the queen in her crown to, for Maureen, who just joined us, we're in chapter 1 and of the book of Esther, and we are at verse 11. Okay, so.
Where's the book of Esther?
What book?
Is the book of Esther in the
Good.
hymns?
Book of Esther.
I can't, it's not in
Okay. So at this point, give me 1 second. Let's just see. I'm just gonna send her a note.
I don't know what page.
Okay.
Probably in the numbers, probably where you left off from last week.
I don't think so.
Okay, good. All right. So here we are. Give me 1 more minute. Put that down. Okay, so King Ahasuerus orders that Vashti come before him to display her beauty in the crown. So it's not clear exactly what's going on here. The rabbis want to suggest in her crown and nothing else, right? Giving us a sense, this is a drunken party and she is here as the king's prized possession to be displayed before these drunken men. And I want to emphasize this too, because I think that one of the themes here is really misogyny. And it's really about Esther, who finds her voice and stands up. There is a feminist element to this story. At any rate, she's also described here as calmly to look at. There's one other person in the Hebrew Bible described that way, and that is Joseph. He is also described in the same Hebrew words. And that story, the story of Joseph, who also goes into the king's palace in Egypt, is elevated to high stature. We're going to see the same description is used of Esther as well. And there are some parallels between Esther and Joseph, and it's simply worth noting. Okay, so Queen Vashti refused to come according to the word of the king by the eunuchs, and the king was furious and his anger raged up. Now, why does she refuse to come? We don't know. But certainly one reason is that she doesn't want to display herself this way. The king said to the sages, experts in protocol, for thus was the king's practice before all the experts in rule and law and those closest to him. And then we have a list of them, the 7 ministers of Persia and Media, according to the rule. What should be done with Queen Vashti because she has not obeyed the king's dictate by the eunuchs, right? So here Vashti refuses to do what the king has ordered her to do. One of the things we're going to see is that Vashti is quite parallel in her behavior and in the consequences of that behavior to Mordecai. She refuses to come. Mordecai refuses to bow before Haman. The consequences here we'll see, and I'll go on and read that. What do they say? Menuchan said before the king and the ministers, not only against the king has Vashti done wrong, but against all the ministers and all the people that are in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's act will go out to all the women to hold their husbands in contempt in their eyes when they will say, King Ahasuerus said to bring Vashti before him, and she did not come. And this very day, the noble women of Persia and Media will say to all the king's nobles that they heard of the queen's act, and there shall be a full measure of contempt and fury, right? So we're going to generalize from this one case, right? This woman who refuses to come, to all women. And we're going to see that there are going to be real consequences for women throughout Persia, at least the unmarried virgins in Persia. And I want to suggest this too parallels to the story of Mordecai, who refused to bow. And what are the consequences? The consequences are dire for the entire Jewish community. So again, Vashti and Mordecai seem to be somewhat similar. Now, Vashti here is unjustly, it would seem, punished. At least it's understandable why she wouldn't want to come out under these circumstances. And we'll see the same thing with the Jewish community. If it please the king, let the royal decree go out from before him to be written in the rules of Persia and Media, not to be transgressed, that Vashti did not come into the presence of King Ahasuerus, and her queenship should be given to another better than she. And let the king's edict, which he will be issued, heard throughout the kingdom, large though it is, and let all the wives accord worth to their husbands from the greatest to the least. The thing was good in the eyes of the king and the ministers. The king did what Menuchan said. He sent out ministers to all the provinces, to every province in its own writing, to every single people in its own language, that every man should rule his home and speak the king's language, right? So here we go. Not only doesn't she come, but now all the husbands in Persia are going to make sure that they rule. And again, I think running through here now is going to be a feminist theme, that this whole thing is being set up. And I'll show you what I mean in a while. Okay, we've finished chapter 1. I'm simply going to open it up now for questions, if there are any, or comments. Go ahead. Yeah.
So, one of the things we're seeing here is that a certain act, if left unanswered, is an attack on the social order.
Yes, I think
And
that's
we see that today in national politics and now international politics. Certain actions, if left unanswered, attack democracy itself.
yes, but here I think we'll see in a minute the consequences, right? So I think the argument is not being viewed as a valid argument, right? Whether, in other words, so Vashti needs to be punished for refusing to come to the king, but there's no reason why this has to be taken out on all the women of Persia, right? There seems to be an excess here, just as we'll see in terms of Mordecai, a certain excess. Other comments or questions? Yeah, Sandy, go ahead.
So Rabbi, I have the altar book and I have a machine that'll allow me to display it if you want, so everyone can see what you're reading.
Sure, that would be fine.
You have to allow me to share screen, however.
Okay, I can do that. Let me see if I can do that. I need to find you here.
It would be under participant.
Yeah, I've got you. So I guess I need to make you the host to do that.
No.
I don't see
No.
anywhere.
Security, do you have something called security? Do you see security on the left?
Oh, security. Okay, I'm looking in the wrong place.
Security
left.
and then
Yes,
allow
I got it.
others.
I got it. Okay. You can now share screen, but let's give me a minute to do this. Okay, and do this. Okay. Before we go on to chapter 2 then, any other comments? If not, we'll go right on because there's lots to cover. Okay,
Because I
chapter
still
2 and,
Oh,
okay, Sandy, can you make that sharper?
Yeah, I'm working on it.
Okay. All right, so let me continue. After these things, when King Ahasuerus's wrath subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what was decreed about her. And the king's lads, his servants, said, "Let virgins calmly to look at be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officials in all provinces of his kingdom, and every young virgin calmly to look at be gathered at Shushan to the women's house by Haggai, the king's eunuch, keeper of the women, and let them be given unguents. And the women, young women, be pleasing in the eyes of the king, shall rule in Vashti's stead." All right, so what are the consequences for the women of Persia? They're going to be brought to the king. They are going to be marinated. Right? This is almost the issue, the image here, I think, is of meat. They're going to be, these unguents are going to be, they'll be bathed in them so that they're really soft and beautiful when they come to the king's bed. And they will be serially raped. I mean, there's no other way to put this. They are brought to Shushan, they are kept under guard, and one by one, they will be brought to the king, to his bed, and then they'll be sent off until he wants them again. So again, I think what starts with Vashti, taken out on all the women of Persia. One other thing to mention here, the king doesn't seem to make any decision. It's always his advisors telling you, what should I do about Vashti? This is what you should do. Okay, now we'll bring you these women. He's very passive, extremely passive. If this was an actual story, what went on in ancient Persia, it's hard to imagine a king who rules 127 provinces, who doesn't know what to do, even among something as simple as how he can deal with a queen who is unwilling to come to him. All right, so, and he was pleasing in his eyes, and they did that. Okay, and now we get the hero, the first of two really introduced. There was a Jew in Shushan, the capital. Right? His name was Mordechai, son of Yair, son of Shimi, son of Kish, a Benjaminite man. So we know Mordechai is important because we get his whole genealogy. That's a sign that he's a really important figure. And he is from the tribe of Benjamin. And I'm going to come back to that fact in a little while. And he had been exiled from Jerusalem with a group of exiles that was exiled with Jehoniah, the king of Judah, who Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had exiled. And he became the guardian to Hadassah, which is to say Esther, his uncle's daughter. So she's his cousin, for she had no father or mother, right? So he is his cousin, and she is also in some sense his adopted daughter. I want to say something about their names. Mordechai is very closely related to the name of the Persian and Babylonian god Marduk, right? And Esther has two names. She has a Hebrew name, Hadassah, And she also has another name, a secular name, and that is Esther, very closely related to Ishtar, the name of the Babylonian Persian goddess. Now, the reason I want to emphasize that is again to talk about how assimilated these Jews are, really how assimilated. You know, this would be like having a man named Jesus whose daughter is Christina. Right? I mean, the Jews do this, right? But, and again, we'll see no mention of God in this book at all. All right. The young woman was comely in features, comely to look at. And when her father and mother died, Mordecai had taken her as his daughter. And it happened when the king's word and his rule were heard that many young women were gathered in Shushan, the capital of Haggai, and Esther was taken into the king's house by Haggai, the keeper of women. For the young woman was pleasing in his eyes, and she won favor before him, and hastened to bring her the unguents and her share of food to give her, and the 7 young women who were fit to give her from the king's house. And he singled her out and her young women for good treatment in the queen's house. So here we see Esther looking very much like Joseph. She's good looking, he's good looking. She's taken into the house, in this case, the king, and what happens, finds favor. Everywhere she goes, she finds favor. Esther did not tell them who her people were and her kin, for Mordecai had charged her not to tell. So she's in disguise. I said everybody's masked, everybody is not who they appear to be. She doesn't want people to know she's Jewish. The king, this powerful, powerful king, well, he's not really powerful at all. He's actually very weak and reliant entirely on the advice of his advisor. So when each woman's turn came to come before the king, at the conclusion of her having 12 months, according to the women's rule, for thus would be the days of their unguents to be completed, 6 months in oil of myrrh, 6 months in perfumes and women's unguent. And in this fashion would the young women come to the king. Whether she would say, whatever she would say would be granted her to take with her from the women's house to the house of the king. In the evening, she would come. In the morning, she would go back to the women's house again. In the hands of Sheshgaz, the king's eunuch, keeper of the concubine. She would not come again to the king unless the king desired her and she was called by name. Right? So they, just as they drink for half a year, it's a fantastic story. She goes in and she is marinated. Her skin is softened. She's covered with perfume. She has her attendants. And she can bring whatever she wants to make sure she's just as beautiful as possible. She'll have her turn, she'll sleep with the king, and she's sent away. When Esther, the daughter of Avichail, Mordecai's uncle, who he had taken as his daughter, when her turn came to come to the king, she asked nothing but what Haggai, the king's eunuch, would say. She found favor in the eyes of all who saw her. Esther was taken by King Ahasuerus to his royal house in the 10th month, which is the month of Tevet, in the 7th year of his reign. And he loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor before him more than all the virgins. And he put the royal crown on her head and made her the queen in Vashti's stead. And the king made a great banquet for all of his ministers, his servants, Esther's banquet, and he granted relief of taxes for the provinces, and he gave gifts in kingly fashion. Okay, so she's the queen, and they have a party, right? Because he loves parties. But more than that, he even remits taxes, right? He's extremely happy with her. And when the virgins gathered a second time, right? Now, what does this mean? They brought all these women and he has slept with them one after another. By the way, you know, when I was a kid, They told me the Purim story. You know what they said? You probably have heard this too. It was a beauty contest, right? They had a beauty, because what do you tell kids? They had a beauty contest and Esther won the beauty contest. Again, this is serial rape, right? And even when he finds the queen, they go gather more women. I mean, it's unbelievable here. Okay, so what's going on now? Mordecai, right, her cousin, who is also her adopted father, is sitting in the king's gate threshold, sitting in the king's gate. And what does it mean to sit in the gate? It means not that you're literally sitting in the gate, but in antiquity, the gates were where the business of the city took place, and specifically where the law courts were to be found. So to say that Mordecai sat in the king's gate is to say that he's a minor official within this enormous bureaucracy of ancient Persia. He's a person that has a little bit of standing. At any rate, he's there, and Bigetha and Theresh, two of the king's eunuchs, of the guardians of the threshold, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Right, so what we have here is a mutiny. They're going to plot to kill the king, right? And Mordecai finds out about it, and he tells Esther, and Esther speaks to the king in Mordecai's name, and it was searched out and found to be so, and the two of them were impaled on stakes, and it was written in the book of Acts before the king. So it goes into the King's Chronicles, and this whole little story, of course, is going to become very important later on. So we're up to chapter 3, and again, I am going to pause. Sandy, if you'll give me back the screen, please. Thanks. Okay, any questions on chapter 2 before we go on with chapter 3? Anybody at all? Yeah, Saul, go ahead.
It's interesting that these eunuchs plotted against the king. And these eunuchs are supposed to be very weak people.
Well, no, I think that's the question, whether eunuchs are really eunuchs, right? Or if this is some kind of title for the people who attend the king. It's unclear. Certainly the ones who are guarding the harem are undoubtedly eunuchs. These eunuchs are, wait, where is it? Right. They are guardians of the threshold, which seems to be, doesn't have to do with the harem. It's not really clear. But they are plotters against the king. This is treason. And Mordecai is the one who made the king aware of it. And that fact, of course, will play into the story later on. Okay, we're going back to the other view. And Sandy, if you'll share now chapter 3. Okay, good. After these things, King Ahasuerus elevated Haman, the son of Hamdatha, the Agagite, and raised him up and seated him higher than all the ministers who were with them. Now, we don't know anything about Haman. And it's really striking that when we had the list of the king's advisors in chapter 1, he's not mentioned. He seems to come out of nowhere, and one assumes that there's a certain amount of resentment from the king's ministers that this outsider has been brought in. Now, I want to emphasize that he is Ha'agagi, the Agagite, right? Because that makes Haman a direct descendant of King Agag, and King Agag was an Amalekite. Now, why do I mention this? Well, there is a biblical command, and actually we read this command. We read it last Shabbos as the second Torah reading, because it's always read right before Purim, to exterminate the Amalekites, because the Amalekites tried to exterminate us when we came out of Egypt. And it is a commandment that is to be followed in every generation. Now, King Saul was supposed to do this, but he didn't do it, at least not entirely, because when he had the opportunity to, he let the king of the Amalekites go. And this fact, the king of the Amalekites, whose name is Agag, and this fact causes Saul to lose the kingship. Now, what I want to say is this. Not only is Haman a descendant of that king that Saul let go, but Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin, right? And so was, of course, Mordecai. And so what we see playing out here, I think, is actually the end of that story where Mordecai, a descendant of Saul, does what Saul didn't do. And so not only are we connected to the story of Joseph here, but we're also connected to the story of Saul, the king who loses the kingship by not obeying God. Okay, so he's seated high, and there's going to be a lot about high and low here. The king's servants who were in the king's gate would kneel and bow to Haman, for thus had the king charged concerning him, but Mordecai would not kneel and would not bow down. So this, of course, is going to be very bad for the Jews. Mordecai, just as Vashti refuses to come, and there are going to be consequences for lots of women in Persia, here Mordecai is going to refuse to bow, and the consequences are going to be dire. Why does Mordecai refuse to bow? We are never told. We don't know. And there are at least a couple of reasons. So when I was in Hebrew school, not only was I told that this was a beauty contest, but I was told that Mordecai refused to bow because Jews don't bow down to anyone, right? We only bow before God. It's plausible. I think it's unlikely. People do a lot of bowing in the Bible. Why Mordecai would be different. It's possible that Mordecai refuses to bow before Haman, specifically because Haman is a descendant of the Amalekites, the ancient enemies of the Jewish people, and he would not bring himself to do that. There is another possibility, and that is that who is this guy? I'm an official in the court of the king. I don't know why he was any more worthy of becoming the viceroy than I would have been, right? There may be some jealousy here. At any rate, even though the king said to do it, just like the king said to Vashti to come, he refuses. All right, so what happens next? As it happened, they said this to him day after day. They kept telling him to bow, he wouldn't do it. And they told it to Haman to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for he had told them he was a Jew. Now, why Mordecai told them that he was a Jew when he wouldn't let Esther? Oh, one other thing I want to say. I forgot to say this, so let me say it now. I said that they're very secular, right? They have these names. The other thing is, what is Esther eating? Right? We think of her as this pious Jewish woman. I don't think they serve kosher food in the palace. Right? And Mordecai well knew that when she was gathered, and he said, don't let them know you're a Jew, right? Again, these are very secular Jews. Okay, so Haman saw that Mordecai was not kneeling and bowing to him. He brimmed with wrath. He scorned to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they told him who Mordecai's people were, and Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, Mordecai's people who were in Ahasuerus's kingdom. So now Mordecai's refusal, the ante has been upped. Haman wants all the Jews, right? And the entire Jewish community is going to be threatened. Now, it's interesting to note that the Persians were not particularly anti-Semitic. In fact, their policy towards other people and other religions seem to be extremely tolerant. So this is a little bit strange, but there is a sense, I think, that it's not good to be Jewish nonetheless. Esther is not to tell that she's Jewish. And here we have a classic anti-Semite, right? And again, a descendant of Amalek, who is the archetypical anti-Semite and who kind of represents symbolically evil in the Bible. What happens? In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of Ahasuerus's reign, he cast a pur, that is a lot, that's where the word Purim comes from, for every day in the month and every month of the 12, and it fell on the month of Adar. And Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered and separate from the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. The rules are different from every people's, and they do not observe the king's rules, and it does not pay for the king to leave them in peace, right? This is the classic anti-Semitic. They don't follow the law. They aren't to be trusted. You can't leave them alone, right? Notice that Haman doesn't say who they are. He keeps this extremely vague. There is a people, right? If it please the king, let it be written to wipe them out, and 10,000 talents of silver will I measure out to the court overseers to bring to the king's treasury. This is a fortune. This is tons of silver, literally tons of silver, right? So it's not just a bribe, right? And the whole thing is undoubtedly exaggerated, right? The king removes his ring from his hand and gives it to Haman, the son of Hamdata, again a descendant of Agag, foe of the Jews. The king said to Haman, the silver is yours, and the people to do with what is good in your eyes. He said, nah, you don't have to pay me. Just take them. Do what is good in your eyes. The king's scribes were called together in the first month on its 13th day, and it was written as all that Haman had charged to the king's satraps and the governors in every single province, according to their mode of writing, and the ministers of every single people, every single province, according to the language and the name of King Ahasuerus. It was written, and it was sealed with the king's seal ring, and the missives were sent out in the hand of the couriers to the king's province to destroy, to kill, to wipe out all the Jews from young lad to old man, babes and women, on a single day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to take their spoil, right? Kill them all. This is what Haman, king didn't tell the king this. This is what he wants. He wants to destroy every living Jew. And as an incentive, by all means, take their property, right? And it is copy the writings, given to every single province, manifested to all the peoples to be ready for the day. It's still going to happen on that day. And they rush out, and the rule was given out in Shushan, and the king and Haman sat down to drink. And the city of Shushan is confused. I don't really know what this is about. Now, Haman gives out this murderous order. And what does he do? Have a drink. This is a little reminiscent of the Joseph story. What happens when Joseph's brothers put him in the pit, right? Expecting to kill him? Let's have lunch. Right? And that's what they do. They sit down and they eat. And one gets a sense of the real callousness here. Sandy, if you would return me to the screen, thanks, and I will open the view. And anyone who has a comment or a question on chapter 3, I welcome it. Okay, if not, we're running on. Chapter 4, and let's go back. Okay, so Mordechai knew that all that had been done. He tears his garments, puts on sackcloth and ashes, went into the city, cried out loudly and bitterly. So they may not be observant Jews, but they know mourning customs, sackcloth. And it's unclear, by the way, whether this is specifically Jewish, right? Maybe it's just how people show their mourning, right? Ashes are powerful. We see this even today, Ash Wednesday, right? And you put ashes on your forehead. And tearing clothing is a classic sign of mourning. And he's making a scene right in front of and I think probably hoping that Esther will notice, that she'll find out, because he can't go in there. He comes as close as he can to the palace and he does what he can. He comes as far in as the front of the king's gate. No one could enter the king's gate in clothing of sackcloth. And in every single province where the king's word and his rule reached, the Jews were all in great mourning and fasting and weeping. Dirges, sackcloth, and ashes were laid out for the multitudes. And Esther's young women and her eunuchs came and told her, and she was badly shaken. She sends garments to clothe Mordecai to remove his sackcloth, but he did not accept them. Right? She wants him to come in. He can't come in wearing that. So she sends him clothes, and he's not coming in. Right? And Esther calls to Hatach, one of the king's eunuchs who had been stationed before her, and she charged him concerning Mordecai to find out what this was and for what this was, right? So he won't come, so she sends a representative. Just go find out about this. And Hatach went to Mordecai in the city square in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him all that had befallen him and the matter of the silver that Haman had meant to weigh out in the king's treasuries for the Jews to wipe them out. And the copy of the writing of the rule was given out in Shushan to destroy them. He gives a copy of the letter which was sent out. He gives it to be brought to Esther so she can see this is really what's going on, to tell her and to charge her to come to the king to plead with him and to entreat for her people. So Hatach goes back and tells Mordecai's words to Esther. And Esther says to him and tells him to tell Mordecai, all the king's servants and the people of king's province know every man and woman who comes to the inner court without having been called. A single rule is to be put to death unless the king reaches out with the golden scepter. And I have not been called to the king for 30 days. Sorry, I can't go in there. I haven't even, the king, I seem to have fallen out of favor with the king because he hasn't called me. And remember, there are all those other women who are going in night after night. All right, so they tell Esther's words to Mordecai, and Mordecai responds. And this is really something. He says, do not imagine to escape of all the Jews in the house of the king. So he says, hey, you're Jewish. You think because you're living in the palace, you're going to escape? Your fate is now here, Mordecai, who had told her, hey, don't let anybody know, is now telling her, hey, they'll know, right? And you're not going to escape. And if you remain silent, relief and rescue will come to the Jews from elsewhere, and you and your father's house will perish. So this is the most religious line in the book of Esther. God is not mentioned. There will be help that will come from somewhere else, but you won't survive, and it'll be the end of your father's line. So is he just threatening her? It's unclear. And then he says, who knows whether for just a time like this you have attained royalty. So what does he say? Hey, it's bashert, right? You were meant to be there. This is the way things work. So again, there is this kind of religious tone. There is this sense that the Jews are protected. There is a sense that it's not coincidental that Esther is where she is. And at this point, we see a different Esther. this book is in part not only the story of women who are persecuted, but it's also the story of a woman finding her voice. And now, in the past, Mordecai told Esther what to do. Go in, don't tell him you're Jewish. And now, Esther said in response to Mordecai, go, assemble all the Jews in Shushan, fast on my behalf. Don't eat or drink for 3 days, day and night. And I too, with my young women, will fast in this fashion. And so I shall come to the king, not according to the rule. And if I perish, I perish. And Mordecai did all that Esther had commanded him to do. So she accepts her role. She speaks with authority. She is willing to risk her life for her people. I have to say, this year for me, this statement, and if I perish, I perish, has a strange resonance with Ukraine, whose leader is essentially saying that, right? If I perish, I perish. Okay, chapter 4, we're now going to switch back. And any comments or questions? Yeah, Saul.
I had a question about the 2 words in chapter 3, the word poor and the word goral. Now, goral is in the Torah, an acharimot.
Yes.
Poor,
Poor is a Persian word.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's interesting that we have to explain the meaning of poor. You would expect it to be the other way. But yeah, poor is a Persian word. There are a bunch of words in the Megillah that are Persian words. And it's interesting, right? Because it seems to have been written in Persia. Okay, chapter 5. We're moving along. We're just about out of time. So we're going to just jump a little bit here. I'm going to jump ahead. So what happens is the queen goes in, and the king says in verse 7, what troubles you, Queen Esther? What is your request? I'll give you up to half the kingdom. Well, apparently she's still in his heart, right? If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet which I have prepared for him. And the king says, hurry to Haman to do Esther's bidding. Now she's commanding again. And the king and Haman come to the banquet that Esther had prepared. And the king says to Esther at the banquet, what is your petition? It will be granted to you. What is your request? Up to half my kingdom. And Esther answers and says, my petition and my request, if I have found favor in the eyes of the king, and if it please the king to grant my petition and my request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet I will prepare for them tomorrow, and I will do what you ask. So why do we need a second banquet? Right? I mean, she's there, Haman's there, it's time. And I think that here, we see that Esther is, the magnitude of what she's doing is just overwhelming. And she's not quite ready. She's given orders, but she hasn't built up the courage to do what she needs to do. And again, this is the story of Esther, and it's the story of her becoming truly a queen and truly empowered. And so they're set away. Mordecai, Haman is thrilled. It's going to have a banquet, private banquet, just with the king and queen. Unfortunately, on his way, he runs into Mordecai, and he is absolutely incensed. He comes home, he talks to his wife. He says, it's great, but it's ruined for me. And his wife says, create a stake 50 cubits high. In the morning, say to the king that Mordecai should be impaled on it, and you'll come to the banquet happy. Just one thing. I mean, here he says a stake. We often talk about a gallows. It seems, and we'll see that Haman's sons, it says explicitly they're killed and then they're hanged. And from this, and from what I can tell you about rabbinic literature also, it seems that hanging and killing, or impaling and killing, are not the same thing. First, they were killed, and then they were impaled or hung. The idea is that it's a way of disgracing them, displaying their body like that. If you saw the King of Thrones, there's a very graphic image of people's heads being put on the pikes coming up from the castle, and it seems to be something like that. So what happens, of course, then is that Haman is coming. He's coming to see the king, but the king's been up at night, and he read about what Mordecai did. And when Haman walks in, instead of being there to tell the king that he wants to get rid of Mordecai, what does the king says? He says, "Come in. What shall be done for the man the king desires to honor?" And Haman says to himself, "To whom would the king wish to honor more than me?" And he says, "To the man whom the king desires to honor, let him bring royal raiment that the king has worn, and a horse on which the king is ridden, and set a royal crown on his head, and give raiment to the horse into the hands of the man of the king's nobles, the courtiers. Let them dress the man whom the king desires to honor, and ride him on the horse through the city square to call out, 'Thus shall be done to the man the king desires to honor.'" So this is what Haman wants done to him. And I have to say, he wants to wear the king's clothing. He wants to ride the king's horse. I think it's not a stretch to say he wants to be the king. Now, later on, and we don't have time to do much more, so I'll point this out. Later on, of course, at the second banquet, Esther reveals to the king that Haman is the one who wants to kill her and kill the Jewish people. The king is incensed. He goes out. When he comes back in, Haman is there pleading with Esther on the couch that she's lying on. And the king comes in and he says, "Will you rape the queen before me in the castle?" Right. So Haman is dumb. But it's interesting because what does it mean to sleep with the queen? It means you become the king. There was a whole story with David and his sons, and one of them in rebellion and sleeping with his concubine in order to establish himself as the heir. So I think that the challenge here is not only that, you don't sleep with the queen, my wife, but there's also a sense that there is treason, that Haman is that evil. Okay, so I'm going to jump ahead now all the way to chapter 9, and beginning with verse 20. The Jews have won. You know the story. They say, "What is a Jewish holiday? They tried to kill us. We won. Let's eat." Right? And this is what happens here. And finally, we're going to go to chapter 9, and I want to begin with verse 20. And as soon as Sandy gets that up. So Mordecai wrote down these things and sent mitzvah to all the Jews who were in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. What did he send? That they should make the 14th day of the month of Adar and the 15th day every single year, like the days when the Jews had respite from their enemies, and the month that was turned to them from sorrow to joy, from mourning to holiday, to make days of banqueting and rejoicing, sending portions of food to each other and gifts to the poor. So these become the mitzvahs for Purim. There are 4 of them, right? One is to hear the story, megillah. The second is to have a banquet, a Purim Sudah, a meal on the day, and send portions of food, shalach manos, gifts of food to friends and neighbors, which has become a nice fundraiser for synagogues these days. And finally, don't forget the poor. Give gifts to the poor. And then for the Jews to accept all that they had begun to do and that Mordecai had written. And the Jews do accept it. And we see the Jews at the bottom of the page in verse 27, the Jews fixed and accepted for themselves and for their seed and all who would join them, never to be violated, to make these 2 days that were written according to their time in every single year, that they should remembered and done in every generation. Right. So what is the basis of the celebration of Purim? It is the Jewish community who accepted it and took it upon themselves for them and for all their generations. This is an extra biblical verse. The other holidays don't work this way. The other holidays, and we're going to get Hanukkah, but that's much later. The other holidays, God said, make Passover, make Sukkot, make Shavuot, sound the horn on Rosh Hashanah, fast on Yom Kippur. Here in the diaspora, we get a Jewish holiday created by the Jewish community. And of course, we're going to see this later when we return from the diaspora, and Yom HaAtzmaut, a full Jewish holiday, Israel Independence Day, will also be accepted and decided upon by the whole Jewish community. Okay, so if you, Sandy, will return me back. We are done, and we even ran over a little bit. I wish we could have done more. Any questions that anyone has or comments? Yeah, Saul, go ahead.
Yeah, this always bothers me. In chapter 8, all of a sudden, it says in the Hebrew, they were reading the books of the king, B'chodesh HaShlishi, who Chodesh Shivan. Where does this come in all of a sudden? We're talking about Adar. Are they doing this later on as a history of the account?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. No, everything takes place in Adar. The thing gets set up in Nisan. It takes place in Adar, and now we're in Sivan. That's all I can tell you. I don't know any better than that. But the context seems to suggest it. Or even, I just had a thought. Let me just tell me chapter and verse again. Let me find it.
Chapter 8. I'm using the Tikkun, so I don't have the numbers
Yeah,
of these.
you don't have chapter and verse.
Chapter 8. It's chapter 8. I can guess. I can guess. It's probably 15 or 20. ויקראו ספרי המלך בעת ההיא בחודש השלישי הוא חודש סיוון בשלושה ועשרים בו וייכתב בכל אשר ציווה מרדכי אל היהודים ואל החשדתרים והברכות ושרי המדינות השם יהודו על כול שם. It's a recapitulation, it looks like here.
Yes, right. So this is the month of Sivan, right? Actually in yeah, let me just see. Yeah, this is the Jews being told way in advance to prepare themselves, right? In other words, they're going to fight back. And the king has given them permission to fight back. And they know the date when the Persians are going to rise up against them. And they're being given the time to prepare. I think that's what's going on there. Okay. By the way, one thing that makes this story, it seems very clear that it is not history. The idea that once the king gives a decree, that the decree can't be rescinded is ludicrous. What king can't change his mind, right? So what we have here is really a kind of fanciful story. It comes out of the Persian Jewish community. It's in some ways the backstory to the celebration of Purim, making Purim a very Jewish holiday, and maybe there was some kind of a festive, like Mardi Gras that existed in Persia even before. A lot of our holidays really predate Judaism. They're given a Jewish spin, and perhaps this is part of it. hard to say. It's a wonderful story. I hope you'll go to shul and listen to the Megillah being read. Next week, I will come back and we will continue where we left off in the book of Numbers. But I wish you a Zisen and Freilach Purim, and I hope to see you then. Have a great week, everybody.
Tk you.
Very much.
Thank
Thank you.
thank you.